Thank you for joining us today for this GHEX Research Committee's Spring Webinar Series, sponsored by the Global Home Education Exchange. As we wait for everyone to join us, please introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you are joining us from. Thank you. We will get started shortly. Yes, as you join us, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us a little bit about yourself. We'll be getting started shortly. All right, so we can make the most of our time. Let's begin. On behalf of the Global Home Education Exchange, I'd like to welcome you to today's research webinar. I'm Dr. Deborah Bell, the chair of the GHEX Research Committee. GHEX is an international NGO with the purpose to connect and equip policymakers, researchers, and organization leaders who are interested in home education. GHEX was founded with the purpose of advancing the freedom to home educate. GHEX affirms home education as a human right, regardless of a person's motivation or methodology. We work with a diverse group of leaders from all regions of the world and are organized through our committees of action, as well as our 4 regional committees for Asia Pacific, Africa, Latin America, and Europe. Today's webinar will be moderated by Dr. Albert Cheng, Assistant Professor at the Department of Education Reform in the College of Education and Health Professions at the University of Arkansas. He will introduce our presenter and take your questions following the presentation. Dr. Cheng also serves as a GHEX Research Fellow. Our research fellows are accomplished academics with a scholarly body of research. They advise GHEX and are integral to our efforts to connect the academic community with the global home education movement. Our goal for our occasional research webinars series like this one is threefold. We want to bring to your attention new research that investigates or pertains to home education so that information we share with the press and policymakers is current and accurate. Secondly, we want to connect the academic community with practitioners and home education leaders around the world to foster understanding and exchange of information. And thirdly, we want to provide a model for emerging scholars to emulate as they prepare their own research studies and scholarly presentations. Along those lines, I'm pleased to announce that planning for the next GHEX Global Conference is underway, and we will be announcing more details shortly. But we will provide, once again, monetary awards and travel stipends for the best original unpublished research projects. So get started. We will issue a formal call for papers shortly. With that, Albert, I will turn the webinar over to you. Thank you once again for your contribution to these efforts.
Thanks, Deb, and it's great to be here, and I'm excited and looking forward to our guest today and her work. So let me go ahead and introduce her. This morning, we have Lisa Puga, who's a PhD candidate in the Department of Childhood Studies at Rutgers University, Camden. Being a PhD candidate, it's nice to be all but dissertation, almost done here. And Lisa is actually going to be presenting some work related to that. So looking forward to this. But let me say a little bit more about Lisa. So prior to grad school, Lisa was an English teacher at a charter school in North Philadelphia through Teach for America. And most of her interest, because of her teaching experience, is in urban education reform. And so, Lisa, I want to turn it over to you and yeah, I'd like to hear about your work and kind of make the connection to homeschooling and urban ed reform and the experience of African American families. So Lisa, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Albert. Thank you, Deb. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. It's sort of kind of a trial run of sorts for me for defending my dissertation. I have a presentation today that's based on my 3 empirical chapters. So I'm going to try to distill and condense 3 chapters of information for you all, and it'll help me to sort of flesh through these ideas to be more concise and to think through these arguments that I sort of put forward. For, as Albert was saying, I'm in the Department of Childhood Studies at Rutgers, and that's a department that sort of looks at childhood and children from different disciplines. So with my particular project of examining homeschool families, I really found it important to interview homeschooled youth as well about their homeschooling experiences and how their voices and experiences play into the larger educational debates. So I titled the presentation "Homeschooling is Our Protest," examining 15 Black homeschooling families' perspectives in the context of a Black homeschooling surge. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. For some reason, it wasn't changing the screen. So I conducted my research in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Part of that reason for conducting my study there was because that's where I live. So it was a project of convenience, but also at the time that I was conducting my interviews and participant observations, Philadelphia was sort of making national news for a lot of changes in the school districts of Pennsylvania in general, but also in Philadelphia, there were a lot of layoffs, there were budget cuts, there were a lot of programs that were eliminated from schools, and a lot of people were moving into the homeschooling, or at least contemplating switching to homeschooling. There was a lot of growth in Philadelphia itself. For my study, this took place from the beginning of 2016 to the end of 2017, so nearly 2 years of collecting data. There were 3 phases, and I talked with 15 families across the Philadelphia region. So first were parent interviews. This was not in order, by the way. I didn't do the first phase and then the second phase and the third phase. It was all kind of intermixed as I was meeting families. Some of them grew into the participant observation. So 6 families I got to know really closely and worked with them and, you know, traveled around with them, different homeschooling activities they were involved in. I went to their homes and got to know their families more intimately, I guess you would say. But I interviewed 15 households, which involved 16 parents total. So 15 of whom were mothers. And there was 1 father who participated in an interview. And I will get to that in my 3rd chapter, how I would be remiss to not talk about the gender difference of homeschooling, not, you know, address how it seemed, at least in my research and in research that I've looked up, about how the main people who participate in the homeschooling movement on the front line, so to speak, are the mothers of the family. So what that kind of means for homeschooling, if it is a gendered practice, what that kind of has to say. So that's in my 3rd chapter. So I'll get to that later. But I also had 9 youth interviews with 9 children between the ages of 8 and 15. So that's just sort of a breakdown of the study itself and the methodology. And it was a qualitative research project more than quantitative, even though I do have some statistical breakdowns of trends that I saw and demographic information. So speaking of that, some participant and family demographics, part 1. So this is the first aspect that I'll talk about. There were 25 total participants. So that's the 15 households, 16 parents plus the 9 youth. And then the ethnic breakdown, I'm going to move this little box of our floating heads around so I can kind of see what I'm reading. Okay, so there are 10 Black families, and 4 of whom use the term African American and Black interchangeably, but 6 refer to themselves as Black families. So these are all self-identifying characteristics. One family was half Black, half white due to an interracial marriage. One family was half African, half white due to an interracial marriage. Another interracial marriage was half Black, half Hispanic. And one family identified as Black Caribbean, and one family was a white, the parents were white with 2 adopted children of color. And I interviewed both of those children as part of my study. And the religious status, some of them didn't answer this question on the survey sheet, but others were not only answered it on the survey sheet, but actively talked about that. So I considered those families religious. There were some families who were explicitly not religious or secular families, and then 4 were unknown. So I can't say either way what they were. They just didn't express either way in the interviews or the survey data. And then the socioeconomic status, there were 3 single women who were working class who homeschooled. There was one couple who had the status of married working class. The majority of the participants were considered married and middle class status, and then 2 were married and upper class. So majority were married, but there were some single homeschooling mothers that I also interviewed in the study. So the rise of Black homeschooling, at a recent conference that I presented at in January, I talked about how it was almost comical the earlier days when I would present at conferences and talk about the rise of Black homeschooling. Black homeschooling is rising, but considering how much it has risen lately due to the pandemic, it's almost not even comparable, the rate of Black homeschooling, the significant growth. So these are some pre-pandemic numbers. If you look at the red bar, pink, however it comes up on your screen, that is the percentage of Black homeschooled students pre-pandemic. And so as you can see, the percentage of white homeschoolers typically dominates the homeschooling demographic primarily. But you do see, you know, different studies and different surveys will result in different data about the percentage of Black homeschoolers among the total homeschooling population, but these numbers sort of show around 5%, somewhat depending on the study. This particular study showed sort of a steady rate of Black homeschoolers from 1999 to 2016. But so I sort of looked at different studies and kind of did a mean average of around 5% between 2000 and 2019, you know, fluctuating here and there. And in the spring of 2020, around 5%. Now, some studies say it was higher than that, and you know, that's up for debate. But the most recent data given the pandemic, there was a jump to 16.1% of the homeschooling population, which is very significant because if you look at the percentage of Black students in public education, it's a solid like 14 or 15%. So there's actually an overrepresentation of Black students homeschooling according to the data, and that data could be faulty. We could, you know, question that all day, but it's just kind of significant. This one household pulse survey showed that this huge jump between the spring of 2020, so this is when the pandemic was striking the country and people were, you know, switching to different forms of schooling, or people were forced to homeschool. They declared the rate at 3.3% of Black homeschoolers. And then from spring to fall 2020, this is within 1 year, it jumped to 16.1%. So that kind of shows in a different way. This is kind of just, you know, a descriptive way to see it. And this is a bar graph way to see the jump in numbers. And that is very interesting because now it shows, and I'm curious to see if that number is going to continue, if scholars are going to say that number is actually correct, or that we see a stable number of that happening. I'm excited to see that, as you know, so since the pandemic has sort of ended, what that would look like. But it is also interesting to see how the percentage of non-white homeschoolers is changing the whole homeschooling landscape. We're seeing high rates of non-white homeschoolers in a percentage way. So, and this also this trend, this growth, this significant rise of homeschoolers can be seen across also literature. So if you go on Amazon and just look at some of the resources for Black homeschoolers, there's a proliferation of books that have been written. These books particularly are just from about 2018, 2019 till today. So there are so many more resources for Black families because of the demand for this kind of information for families that are seeking help, they're seeking resources, they're wanting to understand other families that do this and support. And then there are some influencers online in general, right, about many different topics, wide-ranging influencers about different ways to, for education, but also other things. And these are some Black homeschool mom influencers online who I saw. There were advertisements for people to seek these moms' advice because a lot of people were switching to homeschooling, and these were quote unquote expert Black homeschooling moms that had successful blogs. They were well known on the internet. And so it's just kind of an interesting phenomenon to see across sectors, literature, online, blog entries, and then also the data of the rise of Black homeschoolers. So this brings me to my 3 empirical dissertation chapters. I'm going to try to summarize these. I kind of break apart my dissertation according to critiques of homeschooling, and I sort of center my arguments around those critiques of homeschooling. So and I sort of summarize them in the following ways. So critique number 1 could be sort of seen as homeschoolers tend to be white, conservative, and anti-public education. So this kind of critique has been around for a while, and in part because homeschoolers did kind of reflect this stereotype of white, kind of middle to upper class, kind of in suburban areas. And so this is kind of a continuing stereotype of homeschoolers that I sort of address with my first dissertation chapter. And along with this critique comes the fact that homeschoolers are privileged. They have certain defensive posture where they are raising their fists at public education and everything it stands for, and how those homeschoolers are sort of eroding democratic ideals of this country. And so I sort of articulate and outline the critique of homeschooling in this chapter to sort of use my my study to sort of complicate these notions of how homeschooling, the real landscape of homeschooling, and how it's changing so much, and how those critiques are very limiting and also problematic. So here's just some quotes of some of those. A critique of, a defensive posture is clear in much of the homeschool movement. In many ways, the movements of homeschooling mirrors the growth of privatized consciousness in other areas of society. So this is a problematic trend, basically. And so I'm respond to that in the first chapter. In the second chapter of my dissertation, I talk about how there's this critique of homeschoolers as religious isolationists. And you can add that that is problematic. So this is how critics of homeschooling would see homeschoolers. Elizabeth Bartholet would sort of fall under this category. She's very famous. Many of you know of her and have read her work, where she calls for a presumptive ban on homeschooling in 2020. Many homeschool because they want to isolate their children from ideals and values of a healthy democracy, as well as, she argues, abusive parents may homeschool in order to avoid detection. So this is a sort of idea that I raise, and I outline this critique in my second dissertation chapter, and then I sort of use my evidence from my participants and also broader homeschool trends to sort of respond to this idea. And then the third critique that again, a summary of a bunch of scholars, a bunch of critics, I'm sort of distilling as homeschoolers tend to be anti-feminist. And so I talk about this in my third chapter, and this is what I presented at the most recent conference in January. So for those of you who are there, you probably heard me talk about this. And one quote that I'm using to sort of summarize this critique is, the homeschooling movement is simultaneously resisting one alleged failing institution, schools, while reproducing another highly criticized institution, the patriarchal nuclear family. So this is something that I talk about, how the voices of the homeschooling mothers in my research complicate this, because I would argue that they are feminists, and I use sort of a feminist lens to argue against this critique. So I'll try to go through these things. I know we don't have a lot of time for me to go through it really in depth of how I really articulate my arguments, but and I'm not going to go through all my conceptual frameworks right now just for the sake of time, but if anyone has a question at the end, I can go through these. But I talk about the concept of marginality as a conceptual framework. Sorry, I'm going to kind of go quickly. I know it's kind of hectic to see a lot of text on the screen, but just know that these are some conceptual frameworks that I use in my chapters. I use Bell Hooks' concept of home place and sort of link the modern Black homeschooling movement to some efforts in the past that people have used to sort of gain community and a sense of identity. And then I also use Andrea O'Reilly's concept of matricentric feminism, which is a modern way of looking at feminism from a mother's lens. And so matricentric feminism seeks to make motherhood the business of feminism by positioning mothers' needs and mothers' concerns as the starting point for theory and politics. And I sort of use this and then also critique this in a way, in a complicated way. So we'll see what time allows me to get into here. But for the first critique, so for my first chapter, the homeschoolers tend to be white, conservative, anti-public schooling, and also sort of are a threat to democratic ideals. I talk about, you know, the obvious, that what I've just been talking about, how it's a growing politically, philosophically, and pedagogically diverse across racial and ethnic groups. And I sort of use the chicken and egg problem. So rather than homeschoolers perpetuating educational inequalities, I talk about how these inequalities that a lot of critics of homeschooling talk about, they also speak about problems in schools. Those are actually sort of partly the reason my family switched to homeschooling. So we can't disentangle that. We can't ignore those inequalities from why parents are switching to homeschooling. And I talk about how the Black homeschoolers of my study have ample legitimate concerns about the environments of their previous schools or school options. And that came out a lot during the interviews and the conversations that I had. And I use Dr. Amamazama's work a lot. I cite her a lot in my study because she talks about this all the time. She talks about homeschooling as racial protectionism, how sort of families are sort of fed up with Eurocentric curricula, negative teacher attitudes, special education placements, and increased and harsher punishments. And that also came out with my participants too. So just as one illustrative example, Daria was a participant with whom I grew the closest in the study. We still keep in touch and we still talk about these issues. And she has always homeschooled her two daughters. And she, after one of our conversations at a playground, she sent me an autobiographical essay that she wrote in response to our themes that we were discussing about schooling. And she kind of wrote it all out for me. And she wrote, I began homeschooling. She emailed me. I began homeschooling because I was tired, angry, and frustrated, tired of fighting the system, angry from witnessing young people fall between the cracks of education, frustrated by the walls of failure. And she titled her essay, Homeschooling is Our Protest. And I thought that was so powerful. And it was striking, and partly why I used it for the title of this talk and in previous publications that I've written about. This whole chapter I've actually published about, and it's from the majority of this first chapter, talking about schools as inhumane because of negative racial stereotypes. So participants talked about like the idea that Black students lack intelligence, Black students exhibit tendencies toward laziness and passivity, Black students are naturally prone to criminality. So why do we spend time in schools trying to work with students who are just destined for a prison system? And these kinds of attitudes that even if they're not overt, they're subvert and at times overt experiences that students have of these in schools. And so there's other scholars that have written about this, harmful racial stereotypes that white people just don't have in schools, that white people just don't understand. And this is another example from Felicia Davidson. These are all pseudonyms, by the way, of my participants, but she said how working with little kids like my son's age, Felicia says, we're going to use our beauty to discover. This is what some teachers do as a activity in the classroom. So this is just an example of how teachers don't intend for this to happen. And she's really gives teachers the benefit of the doubt. And she says that this is just an example of things that often happen in elementary schools. They say, let's color the rainbow based on the colors that you see on yourself. Well, there's nothing racist about that. But when you get to the brown people, my rainbow can only be brown, black, my hair is dark, my skin is dark. But another ethnicity, another little girl can do a nice brighter color eye, brighter color lip, brighter hair. So you have these things happen in school, and it does something to us inwardly as Black people. You get these assignments, and that has happened to a lot of us in school. You get assignments like that, and you just feel like this, because the teacher may not understand those kinds of things, that they're not on purpose. But I think those things are important, and it's important that we be able to accommodate our Black children's identity development better at home. So that was part of a conversation I had with Felicia. And then when I interviewed some of the youth, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into all my interviews with the youth, but one interesting conversation I had with siblings, Brandon and Lily, shared that they both preferred homeschooling, and it had to do with reasons relating to freedom. And this one little boy, Brandon, was talking about how at their previous school, students were given candy for being good and were given numbers in red pen, and he was just trying to talk about, the punishment system that he faced in school. And it was funny to see him talk about it all. And then he sort of paused and was like, after describing the discipline system, he paused and said, yeah, they treated us kind of like animals. You just need a lot less people in one classroom. And I appreciated that thoughtful critique, because he wasn't necessarily faulting his teachers for the system. He was sort of looking at a broader critique of schools to say, this is kind of the best they could do with what they had. And he is criticizing a broader structure that's going on. So I use that as sort of an illustration of these structures that participants have been talking about. And then research has also shown that white and middle class students are more often experience smaller class sizes, greater exposure to innovative interactive pedagogies, and teachers who sought to foster autonomy, self-direction, and higher order thinking skills. So this is sort of the idea of the first chapter. It's sort of talking about these problems with schools that parents sort of feel they're need other options, and they go to homeschooling as a way to seek a better option for their students. So I just have some concluding responses about that. Just some reactions to that critique. Non-white students are becoming more represented more often. Many of the Black homeschoolers decide to homeschool at least in part because of educational inequalities. Many had many reasons for homeschooling, but this was a commonality that I would be remiss not to talk about. The critiques of school system are legitimate. Families should not be asked to stay in public schools to improve them, which is sometimes the responses they would get for staying in schools. And Black participants account largely describe homeschooling, even when they feel pushed into it. It wasn't really their first choice. They kind of felt like they had to. It was empowering. Okay, so second chapter, homeschoolers tend to be religious isolationists. Now, obviously these critiques all kind of overlap and they're related to each other, but this is one that I sort of wanted to dive into for the second chapter a little bit more. There's widespread agreement that homeschooling is the most radical form of privatization in education and the most aggressive form of choice. So these words, they're sort of evoke this emotion of homeschoolers are sort of this group, this othered group that are a threat to the country, a threat to democratic ideals that we should all be holding in high esteem. Homeschooling, the most extreme form of privatization of education, often eliminates the possibility of the child gaining the resources essential for success. It sacrifices the interests of the child and for the interests of the parents, allowing them to control and isolate the child's development. So, and then obviously Elizabeth Bartholet's paper as well fits into this. So I sort of tackle this critique in two ways. I sort of go about it in two ways. First, I analyze 3 participants' accounts who identify as religious. So I sort of look through my participants at the ones who identify as religious or who express religion as being a profound reason for homeschooling. And then I kind of hold, no offense to people who do quantitative research, but I think qualitative research can really bring in some nuance with this, because you can understand depth of perspectives. And I'll get to that in a little bit too, sort of like a positive note from qualitative research here. And I also, so the second way that I sort of go about tackling this critique is I break apart the private versus public educational debate that happens a lot. And that has to do with the definition of homeschooling itself is getting a little bit complicated, because there are a lot of people who sort of tap into homeschooling and then they don't, they stop homeschooling for whatever reason. They homeschool some children while others go to regular brick and mortar schools. And it kind of complicates this idea of homeschoolers as very ideologically focused of homeschool or die. I did not find that in my research. There were a lot of complicated fluidity of homeschooling. Some people who, chose to do cyber schooling. So they were considered homeschooling, but they used a formal curriculum. So how do we define those homeschoolers? And then homeschoolers who were interested in using some public funds available to them. So are those homeschoolers? And there's even some contention within the homeschooling movement itself of, you're not homeschooling really, like you're not a purist homeschooler. And so those kinds of tensions, I think, can help break apart these critiques of homeschooling, because there's not really this ardent boundary around them that I think a lot of critics like to believe. And even pro-homeschooling researchers that try to define homeschooling, I think use problematic notions of homeschooling that might be outdated, that might be limited in who really makes up the homeschool movement. So I'll get into that a little bit more. So what I kind of enjoyed doing in this chapter was I sort of found quotes, or I sort of looked through and found some participant accounts that sort of rang true with what the scholars would say about homeschoolers. So this is Leah Chiamaka, and she said, I would say we started homeschooling for cultural reasons. We practice an African traditional faith. We have certain cultural values we want to instill. And I asked, do all the people who homeschool share this faith? And she said, yeah, it stems off the group that we're part of. We share the same cultural system. It's kind of a no-brainer. We would all homeschool together. We know everyone. We know the focus. We trust each other. We know the type of environment that the children are going to be immersed in, and it would be like they're at home. So I found this, if you were to just take a snapshot of this quote, it would prove these critics true. See, homeschoolers like to cloister themselves together. They like to just do things with each other. And if you were to give this participant a qualitative survey, she would check off the box of, yeah, we are religious homeschoolers. We want to stay together to homeschool because of our values. But through the conversation, she goes on to say, it's kind of funny when it comes to this idea that homeschoolers have this, there's this stereotype that, oh, they're homeschooling, they're hiding in their house, they never get exposed to anyone, they're like hermits or something. the activities my children participate in, I was so excited when I found out about them. There are so many different types. There are a plethora of different opportunities to supplement what you're doing at home. We have so many people, have met so many different people through our children's involvement in soccer, gymnastics, swimming, tennis. I never thought I would be one of those homeschool people. And she talks about how homeschooling afforded her a greater opportunity of diversity of curricula, experiences, and friendships through homeschooling than she experienced in previous schools. And Leah added, homeschooling really allows that opportunity because you have the world is open. So at first glance, if you take a superficial surface level pulse of some of my religious, quote unquote, religious homeschoolers, you get the sense that they're cloistering, they're valuing faith above all other curricula, they're not exposing their children to other families. But through qualitative research, you sort of understand that that's not the intention at all. And qualitative reports kind of can give this sense and perpetuate this idea of what homeschoolers are doing or their mentalities or their missions. And it's not the case. And then one more participant, Frida Cartier, she and her family were interesting. They practiced voodoo out of Haiti. And so she homeschools with other families of the same faith. We work together, but I would say safety to homeschool drives us more than anything. And that's what a lot of critics are worried about. They're worried about homeschoolers sort of see the secular world as dangerous. And that is kind of what Frida is saying. She wants to homeschool. She said that she wants to keep our kids home. She wants to protect them. She wants to give homeschooling the strength they needed and a strong sense of self to not follow the crowd. That sort of idea that critics have about homeschoolers as sort of seeing the other as dangerous. But when you talk with her more, she continues to say, but because of school, and she says also because of schools and the way they teach aren't conducive for African Americans, Latinos, Africans, even Asians, traditional school settings are not conducive to cultivating ethnic identity. And she said, I don't use an overly Afrocentric curriculum and discipline style because the world is not that. To me, it's just as bad as when children only know about white history. I feel like it's polarizing and it's just as bad because the world is not one thing. Yes, they need to know a lot about themselves. They need to know where they come from. But I believe that a world of cultural learning and understanding is what's needed. And then she went on to say, which I don't quite understand how this is possible, but her family travels to Haiti, Brazil, Trinidad, Honduras, Belize, Mexico, Panama, and of course, all over the United States. So she was saying that that is something they value in their homeschooling model. It's sort of this world schooling approach where they want to travel. And that's one of the reasons they homeschool. And her kids played with other kids from other cultures. And she believes that homeschooling is the most conducive educational environment to support their kids in developing their ethnic identity. So if you just kind of stop at the superficial level, it looks like they're religious homeschoolers. Box checked, move on. That's how we can sort of label these people. But talking with her and her family more, understanding that she is kind of more of a world schooler while also valuing her faith, it just provides a lot of complexity that I think we need to sort of take into account when understanding different, homeschool groups. So the second part that I try to do is disentangle this idea of public and private, and public is good and private is bad, but more than that, public schooling and private schooling are at odds with each other. So rather than two planetary orbits that each stem from different philosophical ideas, serve different political purposes, and function as two entirely different cultural processes, my findings from my research, even just my limited research with Black researchers, stretch these normative boundaries. So for instance, we sort of think of kids in brick and mortar schools and then homeschoolers on the other end. But additionally, we have these labels for homeschoolers like unschoolers, school at home techniques, Holtian homeschoolers, Afrocentric homeschooling, cyber schoolers, self-directed homeschoolers. There's all these labels, and we sort of try to establish an understanding of motivation, pedagogy based on them. But these categorical lines are actually often quite blurry, and more blurry than you think. especially when you get into understanding, so some of the demographics that I think that we should be looking at more for homeschooling research in general. I try to look at homeschoolers since the beginning. So 11 families were not homeschoolers through and through. 11 of the families of my research were not homeschooled. They were homeschoolers at the time of my interviewing them, but they weren't always homeschoolers, and they haven't been since then been homeschooling. And only 4 families have been. And then there's who homeschools totally versus partially. So 11 families totally were homeschooling all of their children at the time of my interview, but 4 families only partially homeschooled some of their children, or one child. And that would be interesting longitudinally to understand. And I don't have that data because I don't know all of my families, what they are doing now, but I do keep in touch with some of them. And I know that there have been changes to that. And then something interesting that I wish I looked at in my study is the families utilizing state and district formal curricula. And I can go back and check I don't have that data on tip of my fingers, but also families utilizing district schools, resources, clubs, and classes, and then families utilizing vouchers and state money. So this is sort of what I'm getting at with the fluidity of homeschoolers. They're not necessarily this bounded, privatized group that both critics and pro-homeschooling advocates, I think, often use this discourse. And I think I sort of challenge both of them. And so I sort of get into that. I talk about 22 states now have granted legal right for homeschoolers to opportunistically tap into public resources and public funds. And, the fact that homeschoolers might not homeschool throughout the entire trajectory of their students, or they kind of judge it student by student, is all worthy of exploration and future research. And then I have some concluding responses, which I think I've sort of said throughout, like the poorest educational lifestyle, more than like rigid categories. Okay, so for my final chapter, so I'm kind of rushing through because I'm almost at the end of time, but homeschooling as anti-feminist. So I think a lot of critics of homeschooling this image comes to mind of a mother at home homeschooling her children while the father is away at work. And I remember presenting at a conference once where afterwards this one male scholar came up to me and he said, this is really interesting about, you're talking about Black homeschoolers, but, to me, I just see it as one big tragedy that, women have worked so hard in the feminist movement and now they're going back into the home again. And what an achievement for the patriarchy. And I was sort of like blown away by his, candor, first of all, and also his like assumption of like mothers not really wanting to do this, like sort of just like that assumption, and also how it was just interesting. And I felt the need to defend the participants of my study because I do not see the participants of my study as anti-feminist. And anyway, I sort of question the definition of feminism in this chapter, and I argue against sort of the critiques. So one of the quotes I said already. So the second one here, despite these mothers, this is my favorite quote, one of my favorite quotes I've ever read in my life. Despite these mothers' passionate commitment to and satisfaction in the forms of family life they have seemed to have created, these mothers are effectively colluding in their own gender oppression. So this was a study that was conducted with homeschooling moms. And the male scholar was concluding and drawing, he was looking at some of the evidence of the mothers expressing a lot of burnout. They were stressed at times, and they were honest about that in the study. And so therefore the conclusion is that they are not agents in homeschooling. And so it raises the question of what should a feminist look like? We are in the 21st century. And so it's interesting to firstly have other people sort of define feminism for women as looking a certain way. And I read this one interesting article where there was this elephant in the room of feminist scholarship where a lot of women were leaving the academic world, and they were leaving the corporate world in droves to homeschool. And so this was like in the mid 2000s. There was this article that was written saying, can a feminist homeschool her child? And that's what I titled my presentation in January. So some of you may have heard this presentation already, but I sort of talk about sociologist Jennifer Lois, who talks about people try to lump homeschoolers as homeschooling parents. Homeschooling parents do this, homeschooling parents do that. And she thinks it does a disservice when we realize that the majority of homeschoolers are women. So this makes it homeschooling a feminist issue. And matricentric feminism has sort of spurred to talk about feminism from the mother's perspective and talks about mother's needs and mother's concerns. But I sort of challenge this idea because a lot of people who homeschool, at least the Black mothers that I talk about, and there's this other, Daphne de Marneve talks about, we need to develop a more satisfying, more complex understanding of what women get from mothering, not only the rewards of being responsive to children, but the ways in which mothering is responsive to self. And I appreciate that too. But I also think that we need to talk about how being a feminist means also responding to the family's needs too. And so a lot of participants, like participant Frida Cartier, talks about how homeschooling can get overwhelming. A lot of participants talked about this, but they sort of see it as putting their family above. Some women in my study had successful careers that they left to homeschool. And they saw it as that much of a dire situation that they were putting their family's needs above their own. So yes, we can define feminism in terms of mothers' needs and what mothers want. But I think that there's a lot that I've learned from these Black participants that say, you know, chasing titles is fine, but at the end of the day, what will I be missing? And maybe we need to overturn the male model of success that feminism adopted in and of itself. And I sort of redefine feminism as sort of family-centric feminism. How can we look at feminism differently now? Because I think that there's a lot of people who are choosing things for their family's needs, even apart from their own successes. And yeah, they might get something out of it, but I think that it eliminates some of the more complicated nuance of understanding how you know, a different way of motherhood needing to be at the center of human society from which all social and economic life should spin. Acknowledging that bearing and raising children is not some pesky peripheral activity we engage in, but the whole point. And this is more the sentiment that I was understanding from Black homeschoolers. This idea that it's sort of shifting this idea of what do I want? What do mothers need? What is the best thing for me? And more the family-minded idea. And I think it's super interesting because it kind of complicates our whole understanding of feminism itself. And I end with a quote from the participant, Daria, who just talks about at the end of the day, you're between a rock and a hard place. People would say, your voice would be great in the PTA, hang in there kind of thing. Hang in there, not for my kids' education. And it gets tiring of having to prove it had, you know, she talks about how it's just difficult to try to explain the reasons for homeschooling. And it's a complicated, messy, you know, thing to try to pinpoint why people homeschool. But I think it's really important to understand, you know, the variety of perspectives, even among the Black homeschooling population, and not try to minimize and box in homeschoolers. So that's the end. But just concluding thoughts that I summarized.
Okay, well, I mean, if you want to get a last word in there, you can still. We're good on time. But yeah, thanks, Lisa. That was I mean, I feel like I just learned a ton, and I'm like processing lots of what you said. So anyway, yeah, I do have a few questions, and of course, I'm not the only. I'm not monopolizing the Q&A here. I just want to remind the audience that if you do have a question, just refer down to the bottom of your screen there, and there should be a Q&A tab. So if you do have a question or a comment, please go ahead and open that up and type it in, and I'll ask Lisa on your behalf. So there are a few questions there, but I'll just take the prerogative and just ask one broader one to start. And so I think you did a real nice job articulating some conceptual frameworks, and then providing some empirical evidence based on your interviews to back up and explain, hey, this is how we can view and understand homeschooling. And throughout your presentation, you also kind of intersperse it with the critique, right? So basically, other people would take perhaps a different conceptual framework to look at homeschooling. So I guess my question's in two parts. So one is, so why do these, I guess you use the word critique or maybe myths, different ways of viewing homeschooling, like it's anti-feminist, but then you made an argument that actually it can be feminist and empowering for women. So my first question is, why do you think some of these older critiques and myths still persist? And then, what's your response to scholars who insist on a different way? I mean, you cited a lot of folks that said, I forget who it was, or even, the person you brought up in your presentation, how homeschooling is basically reinforcing the historic patriarchy. Why do these myths persist, and why do you think people see it a different way? And why do you think could they be right in other circumstances, or do you think your conceptual framework might generalize?
Yeah, I definitely have to be humble in that I am not an expert on homeschooling nor on all homeschoolers, especially given the limited sample size of my study. But one of the things that I appreciate critiques of homeschooling. I mean, it's good to question and to challenge, especially ways that homeschoolers might be privileged and might kind of be problematic in some ways of thinking about. I don't know. I guess one of the things that I just see as that I try to argue, especially in my second chapter, is that I think there's just these stereotypes of homeschoolers as kind of like this specific group. And so once you kind of create a stagnant box, it's easy to then kind of jump and extrapolate back based on that, on their mission in the world and what they're trying to do. And it's I think as humans, we have a tendency to other, whether you are religious or not, or you are homeschooling or not, it's kind of a tendency we have to work against. And that's what I try to argue, to not other any specific side, to not demonize schools and to not demonize homeschooling, because then you're kind of just both falling into the same problematic exercise of, othering each other. So I think one of the things that the homeschooling movement, for better or for worse, is to try to protect homeschooling for the rights of homeschooling. There has been a lot of definitions of homeschooling for that sake. So it's like, this is why homeschoolers need rights, which is super important. I'm not trying to argue against that, but I think that can also lead to some pitfalls where it becomes this bounded group because it has been bounded for a reason of promoting rights. And so that can be one reason why things kind of perpetuate. And I think people don't want to see women stressed out in the home, and they want to see women like have a balance of working on their careers, and that shouldn't be demonized either. And so they don't want that to be threatened, with homeschooling. A lot of people have good intentions with the work they're doing, but I'm just trying to kind of just complicate narratives, and maybe that helps answer the question. But
yeah. Anyway, well, I think you've cast some light and done well at presenting a different perspective. And I just want to also say, for if there's any other grad students in the audience that want a trial run of their homeschooling related research for their dissertation defense, you're most welcome to present here and get feedback from other people. So let me turn to a few questions from the audience here. So, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, but Lisa Treleaven asking has a technical question for you. And so early on in your presentation, you categorized or described your sample as working class, middle class, and you use some other terms in there. So she's asking, were these variables established elsewhere, like in the census, or did you define them yourselves? Like, how did you create those buckets?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think every researcher wants to get some kind of understanding of the population, the sample that they're working with. For my study, I had the participants identify themselves, so that those were all self-qualifying labels. I had a survey that I gave the participants in addition when we were doing the interview for them to fill out. And so those labels could be correct with the national definitions, or they could be off, but it's how those participants saw themselves, or at least how they wanted to define themselves to me on the paper. So I know that there are limitations to that, but that was kind of how I felt the best way to tackle that. I didn't want to ask people's income levels straight up. I just kind of asked them to put themselves, on the survey sheet.
Yeah, and usually those are pretty trustworthy, I think. So Christopher Cordero, I mean, I should probably just read his comment in full. I mean, he's definitely appreciated. Dear Lisa, blown away by your presentation. It answers many questions homeschoolers get asked in the South African Parliament when Mike Donnelly was presenting our portfolio committee on education. And he also remarks that there's many similarities with Black homeschoolers in South Africa, but they don't have research to highlight this. And so he has a question. Can you tell us a little bit more about how single working class mothers in your study homeschooled?
Yeah, it's such a good question, because I was surprised as well. I know that single mothers homeschool, but I was surprised that I had 3 in my sample, because I don't know going in. I would meet these mothers in homeschooling events that were like posted around Philly. I would just kind of show up and talk to people. I don't know who's married or not. And then when talking with them more in depth, I find out sort of how they'd make it work. So for the 3 working class single moms, they would often utilize some sort of online program, and they would work remote, some kind of remote work in tandem with homeschooling, or they would work at night. So I know it was often like I had a lot of admiration for that kind of workload, to commit themselves to homeschooling that much that they would sort of have to do both work full-time and homeschool. But some of them created their own products. I know one mom, she made her own, she was sort of an entrepreneur. She made had her own soap business and sold it online, and kind of she sort of simultaneously used homeschooling in that business just to help the students learn about the business itself. And so it was kind of cool to learn about how entrepreneurs also homeschool and use that in their homeschool lessons. So yeah, they were creative, basically. They had to be creative.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an area of that would produce some interesting research, just how different kinds of families homeschool, and perhaps there's no one solution here. As you say, it's creativity and making most of your opportunity. So just to plug here, I have a comment from Renuka Ramroop. I think maybe this is to have Chris be aware of this, that Renuka writes, I've done research on Black homeschoolers in South Africa and on single mothers in a township. So Chris, just kind of point that out to you if you're looking for some work, and Renuka, maybe we'll have you share that work here at some point in this webinar. A couple other questions with the time we have left here. Just another kind of peeking under the hood type question here. So Mecca Williams Johnson asks, so did you collect any data on methods used by parents to describe instruction on racial identity development? What formats, online co-op groups, etc., did parents use to address other academic content areas. So can you speak to that a little bit about how the practice was, the homeschool practice was actually done, particularly on the issue of racial identity development?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And that was definitely one of my most interesting aspects that I had an interest in, for understanding how parents were meeting this lack in the school system. How were they making up for that, you know, in their homeschooling lives? And I remember witnessing there was like this homeschooling group that would meet kind of informally of mothers with their kids, and they did a couple activities surrounding talking about what race means. They, you know, had the kids also talk about it and their experiences with race in school, and then also just like on the playground, and they would talk about it openly, which I found really interesting. One participant was part of an Afrocentric homeschool co-op. And when we were talking about this in this particular issue, and how she talked about how it was so important and so part of her homeschooling philosophy was to introduce like an Afrocentric curricula, talking about what it means to be Black, she had a son too, and what that all means. So anyway, when we were talking about this in the interview, she was like, you need to come to our co-op. We meet on Thursdays. You just come and you can see how this in action. So I was gearing up to go, and based on her invitation, but then she messaged me in between the time of her inviting me and the time of the co-op saying, you're actually, I spoke with some of the leaders and you are not allowed to enter into this space. People are not comfortable with having a white researcher for obvious reasons going into this Afrocentric co-op meetup. And I totally understood that. And I felt like that was an insight in and of itself, that, you know, people need to have, African-American and people of color need to have spaces where they are, that are like protected, and that they can discuss sensitive topics without, you know, the gaze of a white researcher. You know, apart from being white, I was also a researcher, right? So I'm going to be there with like a notepad. And so I totally understood that, and I appreciated her, you know, honesty. And she apologized profusely, like, I know I invited you, but I'm so sorry people aren't comfortable with it. So I think that in of itself is one of the ways that people, you know, talk about identity development. It's with, you know, other people to sort of share stories in a safe space. So I think, and ways that I don't have access to, so I can't speak to, but it does happen, and I think it's very important.
Yeah. So just maybe it's a few more questions here to wrap it up. So I think maybe I'll get your reaction to Brian's observation. I don't see a question mark at the end of his comment, but that's totally okay. I'll get your reaction to this. So you know, he writes that so many white writers, thinkers, parents at the early end of, so I think he's referring to kind of early on the 70s, the 80s. They're saying the same things, same criticisms about institutional state-run schooling as Black parents and scholars today. In some sense, I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit here, right? Many of them being the white families said that this is our protest and this is our proactive way to live as we want to live with voice, agency, and engagement, regardless of our religious, philosophical, pedagogical, ethnicity, etc. So, so in your view, is this the same thing that's kind of happening in some sense? I mean, you use this is homeschooling as our protest to describe the experience of these African American families. In some ways, could you use that to describe the phenomena that really gave rise to the modern homeschooling movement that started in the 70s and the 80s?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many overlaps, and that's why, I mean, I can only speak to, you know, the Black homeschoolers of my study, since those are the accounts that I had. But I do in my dissertation sort of raise questions to say, you know, is this only typical of Black homeschoolers that protest? And there are other growing racial minority homeschooling groups, like Hispanic homeschoolers are at this point growing even higher than Black homeschoolers, and that's a topic worthy of discussion and worthy of research too. But even people who oppose public schools, for those same reasons, who might not be a homeschooling family of color, could also see those as limitations as well. And so that those are points that I raised in my dissertation also. And I think critics ought to, understand that that is a powerful enough reason to leave schools in general.
Great. So just a few quick ones here, and they're all from Kathleen Mons. So first, perhaps a suggestion. What she's asking if you're aware of Dr. Richie Barnes' work called Strategic Mothering. And so it's just a tip there to check her out.
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Yeah, Strategic Mothering. I think it's, I don't know if it's Richie or Richie Barnes, R-I-C-H-E Barnes.
Yes,
so
I
guess
think I have read about this, and I couldn't talk about that in this particular presentation, but yes, you like broke up, so I couldn't understand what you're saying, but yes, strategic mothering, yes.
Yeah. So and another question from Kathleen is, so I think you did mention that everyone here was interviewed prior to the pandemic, is that correct?
Yes, right.
Okay, yeah. And so anyway, I guess she was just asking how many of them were interviewed prior to the pandemic. I guess all of them were.
Yeah, and I would love to, I don't know about postdoc opportunities, but I would love to do more research about this, because when I'm reading about latest studies about this mass exodus, that people call it the second great migration of Black families moving to homeschooling, I see a lot of similar themes of what I was writing about back in 2016, 2017 with my participants. It's similar kinds of themes, but how the pandemic itself, affects that. It would be interesting, and that is not in the scope of my project, even though I have a lot of relevant, a lot of what I've been finding is still relevant today, and that kind of, even though there's been a gap. So yeah, but thank you, Kathleen, because those are all really good insights.
Yeah. I don't know if this is a leading question from Kathleen. Did you receive funding for your research?
I did. I received the what is it called? The Center for Educational Opportunity grant that Kathalina was in charge of that opportunity. So I applied for funding, and that really helped in the the nitty-gritty portion of my study to get my findings and everything.
Yeah, great. And thanks for that, and Kathalina for being at the helm of that run there. And so our last question is maybe a little more personal. Just just how did Black homeschooling families become the focus of your research interest?
Yeah, so I worked with primarily the school where I taught before grad school. I taught in a 99% African-American school, a charter school in North Philly. And I knew based on that experience, I wanted to study urban education reform. I didn't know how I was going to study that. But when I got into grad school, I was doing research about alternative education, ways that people were going beyond the system, educating creatively through democratic schools, just ways that people were sort of going outside the box. And I found that African-American homeschoolers were growing. And even when I was teaching, I saw some students switching to homeschooling. And I, was naive at the time. I didn't know that was a phenomenon that was happening. I kind of had the same stereotype that homeschooling was mostly white families. And so I started doing a lot of research about it, and it grew my interest because I saw it as directly responding to educational inequalities. And I just wanted to know more. I wanted to understand this because I think it's so important when we talk about educational reform, to talk about people who were marginalized by it, who were on the firsthand recipients of these lack of funds. We can talk all day about improving schools, but at the same time, it's important to understand the ways in which people were directly impacted by it. Sometimes academic circles can talk about ways, educational equality. We need to public education. We have to make these things better. That's what success is. But the reality is that families are the ones being harmed by this, anyway, I could go on and on, but that was sort of the passion behind it.
Yeah. Well, great, Lisa. Thanks again for your presentation. I'm really glad that you're able to share your work here. I think it sounds like the audience here really enjoyed your work, and you certainly gave all of us a lot to ponder and reflect on. Good luck with your dissertation to finish that up. Hopefully that's sooner than later. Anyway, that's going to conclude our webinar this morning. And just last thing I do want to say is to look out for the next webinar in May 11th. We're going to have Dr. Angela Watson present on some of her work, updating the counts of how many people exactly are homeschooling across all 50 states here in the United States. So look out for that announcement and that link, and hope you register, and hope to see you at that time. Till then, Lisa, thanks again for presenting, and we'll all see you next time.
Thanks, Albert. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Albert. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your participation.